For generations, the modern world has viewed the sheep as the ultimate symbol of passive obedience, a defenseless creature that exists solely to be guided, sheared, and consumed. We use its name as an insult to describe those who follow without questioning, who move blindly with a crowd, devoid of independent thought or survival instincts. But this domesticated caricature is a massive historical delusion, a mask created by thousands of years of human selective breeding. Beneath the heavy, soft fleece of the modern pasture dweller lies the dormant genetic blueprint of an absolute mountain tyrant. Long before the first human settlements took root, the ancestors of the sheep, the wild Mouflon, ruled the unforgiving, vertical landscapes of the Mediterranean and Central Asia. These were not gentle followers. They were rugged, aggressive, and highly intelligent survival engines designed to conquer terrains that would destroy almost any other large mammal on Earth. Standing on impossibly narrow cliff faces battered by freezing alpine winds, the wild Mouflon possessed a physical architecture built for high-stakes survival. They did not have thick, useless wool that gathered moisture and debris. Instead, they were covered in a sleek, coarse coat of reddish-brown hair that camouflaged perfectly with the sun-baked granite and shale. Their chests were broad and packed with dense, explosive muscle fibers, allowing them to bound up near vertical rock walls with a single, defying leap. But their most formidable feature was their massive, spiraled horns. Growing up to a meter in length, these heavy weapons were not decorative. They were biological battering rams used to fight off apex predators like leopards and wolves, and to settle brutal territorial disputes during the rutting season. When two wild ram collided on a narrow mountain ledge, the impact could be heard for miles, a terrifying display of raw kinetic force that shattered bones and sent weaker rivals plunging into the rocky abysses below. The cognitive architecture of these wild ancestors was equally sharp, defined by an intense, hyper-vigilant situational awareness. Living in environments where a single second of distraction meant death by a predator's jaws or a fatal misstep on loose gravel, the Mouflon developed an incredibly sophisticated sensory system. Their eyes, positioned on the sides of their heads, granted them a panoramic field of view of nearly 360 degrees, allowing them to spot the slightest twitch of a snow leopard's tail over a mile away without ever turning their heads. They possess a profound, instinctual understanding of topography and wind currents, using the thermal draft of the mountains to detect the scent of approaching danger long before it arrived. They were masters of strategic retreat, choosing resting spots on high, inaccessible crags that offered clear escape routes in every direction, turning the harsh geometry of the mountains into an unbreakable defensive fortress. Humanity's first encounters with this wild titan were not characterized by easy dominance, but by a desperate, bloody struggle for resources. For early hunter-gatherer communities expanding into the rocky highlands, the Mouflon was a legendary and elusive prize, a source of high-protein meat, exceptionally durable hides, and horns that could be fashioned into tools and ritual items. Hunting them required immense stamina, coordination, and a willingness to brave deadly high-altitude conditions. Early humans watched in awe as these animals navigated sheer cliffs with a casual, fluid grace that seemed to defy the very laws of gravity. It became clear that to capture or control such a creature, humans could not rely on brute force alone. They had to launch a slow, calculated, multi-generational psychological campaign designed to systematically dismantle the animal's fierce independence and wild pride. This intense campaign marked the true beginning of the agricultural revolution roughly 11,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. By capturing young lambs and systematically culling the most aggressive, independent rams over hundreds of years, early pastoralists began to slowly rewrite the creature's genetic destiny. The sharp, hypervigilant instincts were gradually suppressed. The massive, lethal horns were shrunk or eliminated entirely through forced breeding, and the sleek, defensive coat was transformed into a continuous, heavy growth of woolly fiber that the animal could no longer shed on its own. This profound biological transformation effectively turned a wild mountain warrior into a dependent, living resource, binding the fate of the flock permanently to the rise of human civilization. Yet, this newly engineered docility was not a regression, but the development of bizarre, collective superpower, a hidden mechanical strategy that would soon allow this species to colonize every corner of the planet through the absolute power of the crowd. The survival of the modern domestic sheep does not rely on individual strength, sharp claws, or predatory speed, but on a highly sophisticated and deeply misunderstood psychological weapon, the collective mind. When humans look at a flock moving in unison across a field, they often see a mindless, chaotic panic, a complete lack of individual identity. In reality, what they are witnessing is a brilliant, fluid defense mechanism that operates like a single, massive superorganism. Individual sheep possess an intense, hardwired neurological aversion to isolation. To a sheep, being alone is not a state of being, it is an immediate death sentence. This deep-seated psychological terror drives the architecture of the flock, turning a group of seemingly helpless herbivores into a complex, moving shield wall that utilizes mathematical precision to frustrate and defeat predators. This collective behavior is governed by a highly specific set of spatial rules embedded deep within the bovine brain, known as the selfish herd theory. When a threat is detected by any single member of the flock, the entire group does not scatter randomly. Instead, they immediately compress inward toward a common center of gravity. Each individual animal frantically attempts to position itself in the middle of the mass, using the bodies of its peers as a physical barrier against attack. This creates a churning, geometric vortex of flesh and wool that moves as a cohesive unit, making it incredibly difficult for pursuing predator, such as a wolf or a coyote, to isolate a single target. The constant, unpredictable shifting of hundreds of identical bodies creates a profound visual confusion, overloading the predator's targeting systems and causing it to hesitate, a hesitation that often allows the flock to escape into safer terrain. Beneath this seemingly uniform collective movement lies a highly structured, invisible social hierarchy that dictates every action the herd takes. The flock is not a lawless mob. It is guided by older, highly experienced females known as ewes, who retain a vast mental map of pasturelands, water sources, and historical danger zones. These matriarchs make the critical decisions for the group, determining when to move, where to graze, and when to flee, with the rest of the flock following their lead with absolute, unquestioning trust. Furthermore, neurological research has revealed that sheep possess an astonishing capacity for facial recognition, able to remember and distinguish between at least 50 different individual sheep and human faces for years at a time. They can read the subtle emotional expressions on the faces of their peers, rapidly communicating states of anxiety, calmness, or alertness across the entire herd within milliseconds through visual cues alone. This intense emotional and psychological synchronization requires a massive, continuous expenditure of nervous energy, turning the quiet pasture into a high-stakes arena of sensory management. The modern sheep's brain is constantly processing the collective mood of the swarm, balancing its own survival instinct with the shifting dynamics of the crowd. If this internal balancing act is disrupted, if the herd is forced into a space that breaks their visual connection with one another, the collective mind fractures, and the animals fall into a state of absolute, paralyzing hysteria that can cause them to trample one another or walk blindly off cliffs. This vulnerability reveals that the swarm intelligence is a double-edged sword, a highly specialized adaptation that requires perfect environmental alignment to function effectively. It was precisely this absolute, predictable reliance on the collective mind that allowed early human societies to turn the sheep into the ultimate biological currency of empire expansion. Human rulers and nomadic chieftains quickly realized that they did not need to control every individual animal. They only needed to dominate the matriarch or deploy a trained herd dog to manipulate the entire collective organism at will. By weaponizing the sheep's innate desire to conform and follow, human civilization unlocked a self-transporting, self-replicating resource that could be driven across vast, hostile landscapes, converting worthless vegetation into the raw materials of civilization. As human empires began to stretch their borders across oceans and uncharted continents, these living swarms were positioned at the absolute vanguard of the invasion, ready to unleash their collective hunger upon pristine ecosystems. When the engines of European global expansion began to roar during the Middle Ages and the Age of Discovery, they were fueled not just by gold and gunpowder, but by the relentless, expanding economic power of wool. The domestic sheep was transformed from a simple subsistence animal into the primary geopolitical asset of dominant nations, a living textile factory whose production capabilities dictated the wealth and stability of entire kingdoms. The British Empire, in particular, built its foundational wealth directly upon the backs of the wool trade, treating the fiber as a strategic resource so valuable that the Lord Chancellor of England was ordered to sit upon a wool-filled sack, the famous wool sack, to symbolize that the nation's political power was entirely supported by the production of the flock. The drive to maximize this biological asset led to the creation of the Merino sheep in Spain, a genetic masterpiece of medieval selective breeding that was guarded like a modern military secret. The Merino possessed a fleece of unprecedented fineness, density, and crimp, creating a fabric that was light, incredibly warm, and highly resistant to water and wear. The Spanish crown realized that this animal gave them an absolute monopoly over the luxury textile markets of Europe, making it a capital offense to export a single live merino sheep outside the borders of the kingdom without royal permission. For centuries, these sheep were managed like a state-owned industrial machine, driven in massive annual migrations of millions of animals across Spain along protected pathways, systematically consuming regional vegetation and transforming the domestic economy into a global financial powerhouse. The true, devastating impact of this fiber machine was unleashed when the barriers of isolation fell, and the sheep was introduced to the pristine frontiers of the New World, Australia, and New Zealand. In these vast, untouched landscapes, the incoming flocks encountered millions of acres of fertile grasslands that had evolved over millennia without ever experiencing the intense, specialized grazing pressures of millions of domestic herbivores. The sheep's unique physical anatomy, specifically their cleft upper lips and sharp, angled incisors, allowed them to clip vegetation incredibly close to the soil line, far lower than native herbivores could manage. This intensive grazing pattern systematically stripped the native perennial grasses down to their roots, preventing them from recovering and allowing tough, unpalatable invasive weeds introduced from Europe to aggressively colonize the disturbed topsoil. As the white blanket of the flock expanded across these new continents, it triggered a massive, cataclysmic displacement of both native wildlife and indigenous human populations. In Australia and New Zealand, pristine forests and diverse scrublands were systematically cleared, burned, and fenced off to make way for the endless pastoral stations required to feed millions of merino descendants. Native marsupials and flightless birds found their food supplies obliterated and their habitats fragmented by the advancing herds, pushing numerous species into rapid extinction. Indigenous human tribes, who had lived in deep ecological harmony with the land for generations, were violently driven from their ancestral hunting grounds by colonial authorities and wealthy wool barons, who prioritized the economic output of the flock over human lives, transforming the geography of entire hemispheres into single-species production zones. This global pastoral conquest established the domestic sheep as one of the most ecologically destructive and demographically successful large mammals on the planet, an unstoppable biological vanguard that reshaped global landscapes to serve human markets. The open ranges and wild frontiers of the 19th century were completely subjugated to the logistical demands of the international wool and meat trades, turning the natural world into a highly structured, capitalist supply chain. However, as the global population of these animals surged into the hundreds of millions, the relationship between man and flock underwent a radical, clinical shift. The romantic era of the wandering shepherd in the open pasture was rapidly replaced by a cold, mechanical reality, where the sheep's ancient biology would be stripped of its natural dignity and integrated into a terrifyingly efficient industrial apparatus. In the contemporary industrial landscape, the sheep has been thoroughly detached from its natural evolutionary context and reimagined as a highly optimized, biological manufacturing unit. The modern factory farming matrix treats the animal's body as a complex equation of inputs and outputs, using the cold tools of science, genetics, and automated technology to strip away any remaining wild variables. This clinical transformation begins at the molecular level, where livestock scientists use advanced genomic mapping to identify and isolate specific alleles responsible for hyper-accelerated muscle growth, extreme wool density, and unnatural multilam birth rates. Natural selection has been completely replaced by high-tech reproductive engineering, including laparoscopic artificial insemination and embryo transfer programs that allow a single genetically optimized ewe to produce dozens of offspring per year through surrogate mothers. This obsession with biological control reached its absolute historical peak in 1996 at the Roslin Institute in Scotland, where a team of scientists successfully created Dolly the sheep, the first mammal ever cloned from an adult somatic cell. This was a profound, reality-shattering breakthrough that permanently altered humanity's relationship with the natural world. Dolly proved that the unique, individual identity of a living animal could be completely bypassed, turning the sheep into a replicable piece of hardware that could be copied and mass-produced with absolute genetic precision. This experiment was not driven by scientific curiosity alone. It was the opening salvo of a new era of bioindustrial design, where sheep could be genetically modified to serve as living bioreactors, producing specialized pharmaceutical proteins and human-compatible antibodies directly within their milk and blood. For the vast majority of the global sheep population trapped within the meat production pipeline, life on the industrial assembly line is defined by a series of painful, automated mutilations designed to adapt the animal's body to crowded, unnatural conditions. Because domestic sheep are being bred to grow an excessive, continuous amount of wool around their hindquarters, they are highly susceptible to fly strike, a horrific condition where parasitic flies lay eggs in the moist folds of their skin, leading to flesh-eating maggot infestations. To prevent this economic loss, industrial ranchers perform a brutal procedure known as mulesing, where large strips of wool-bearing skin are sliced away from the live lamb perineum without anesthesia, leaving a raw, scarred surface that will not grow wool. This is accompanied by routine mechanical tail docking and castration, performed with tight rubber rings or crushing iron tools designed to maintain cleanliness and meat quality in high-density feedlots. The final stage of this industrial matrix is a terrifying, high-volume phenomenon of live export, a global logistical operation where hundreds of thousands of sheep are packed tightly into multi-story transport vessels for weeks at a time. These ships, operating like floating feedlots, travel across burning equatorial oceans to supply international meat markets, creating environments where the animals are exposed to extreme heat stress, poor ventilation, and the rapid spread of respiratory diseases. Trapped in pitch-black, ammonia-choked decks, the sheep's highly sensitive nervous systems are subjected to a continuous state of terror, testing the absolute limits of their biological and psychological endurance. When their bodies finally give out or they reach their destination, they are processed with mechanical, high-speed slaughter systems that turn a living, feeling creature into a neatly packaged, anonymous global commodity. This relentless, high-tech exploitation has successfully reduced the sheep to one of the most heavily commodified and chemically altered organisms on the surface of the earth. We have completely rewritten their reproductive cycles, cloned their cells, and transformed their very flesh into an industrial product designed to maximize corporate profits. Yet, this absolute level of human control is built upon a fragile, dangerous assumption of permanent dominance. Because out on the extreme geographic fringes of our civilization, far away from the automated shearing sheds and the synthetic breeding laboratories, a quiet, powerful resistance is taking shape. In the most hostile, abandoned environments on Earth, groups of domestic sheep are breaking their chains, casting off their docility, and demonstrating an incredible, terrifying capacity to reclaim their wild heritage without human permission. In the remote, wind-scoured islands of the subantarctic, the rugged deserts of western North America, and the abandoned highlands of northern Europe, a profound evolutionary counter-revolution is quietly unfolding completely outside human management. When domestic sheep manage to escape from human enclosures or are left behind on islands following failed agricultural experiments, they do not simply lay down and die as modern agricultural science would predict. Instead, a deeply buried, primordial survival switch flips within their neurological architecture. Within a single generation of wild living, the thick layer of domestic docility that human breeders spent thousands of years carefully constructing begins to completely evaporate, exposing the tough, dangerous core of the ancient mountain warrior waiting underneath. The transformation of these feral sheep into wild, self-sustaining survival engines is a stunning display of evolutionary resilience. One of the most famous examples occurs on the isolated island of Soay off the coast of Scotland, where a population of primitive sheep has lived completely untouched by humans for centuries. These animals do not require human shearers to survive. Their bodies have naturally reverted to a wild shedding cycle, where they rub their heavy wool off against rocks and brambles each spring to expose a sleek, weather-resistant coat of hair beneath. Their limbs become long, lean, and intensely muscled, allowing them to scale near vertical sea cliffs to escape rising tides and foraging competitors. Their horns, free from human genetic suppression, grow back into massive, dangerous weapons that the rams use with lethal intent to defend their harems and establish territorial dominance against all intruders. This feral awakening forces a radical, militaristic restructuring of the animal's social behavior, turning a passive flock into a highly disciplined tactical unit. In the absence of human shepherds and herd dogs, feral sheep abandon their predictable grazing routes and adopt a highly unpredictable, nocturnal movement pattern designed to evade natural predators. They develop a sophisticated scout system, where dominant ewes take turns standing on high, exposed vantage points to watch for danger while the rest of the herd feeds in the valleys below. If a predator, such as a wild dog or an eagle, attempt to approach, the scout emits a sharp, whistling snort that instantly galvanizes a herd into an explosive, synchronized retreat up the steepest, most treacherous terrain available, leaving their pursuers stranded on the rocks below. This incredible capacity to survive and adapt in the wild challenges the very foundational myths of human agricultural supremacy. For 11,000 years, humanity has operated under the arrogant assumption that it conquered the sheep, bending a helpless prey animal to its absolute economic will. But from a broader, macroevolutionary perspective, the sheep has executed a brilliant, high-stakes deception. By trading a portion of its individual freedom for domestic protection, the species convinced humanity to clear millions of square miles of dense forests, eradicate their natural apex predators, and transport their genetic lineage across every major ocean to every corner of the globe, making them one of the most successful large mammals on the planet. They use our global trade networks to achieve total planetary distribution, and now, their wild genetics are waiting quietly in reserve, ready to thrive in the ruins of our empires. Ultimately, the domestic sheep is not a victim of human history, but a highly adaptable, evolutionary shapeshifter that is playing a massive, multi-generational long game for planetary survival. Whether standing quietly inside the clinical metal gates of a high-tech breeding facility or bounding across the storm-battered cliffs of a forgotten oceanic island, they remain deeply connected to the fierce legacy of the wild Mouflon. As our modern industrial systems face increasing ecological volatility and resource depletion, the quiet flock grazing on the hillside stands as a powerful reminder of nature's unyielding adaptability, a species that has mastered the art of survival through the absolute power of the crowd, waiting patiently to inherit the earth the moment human control slips away. If this deep dive into the hidden power and secret history of the animal kingdom changed how you view the world around you, make sure to share your thoughts in the comment below. Subscribe for more cinematic untold documentaries, and hit that notification bell to join us for our next exploration into the wild.